The evolution of consciousness. Plato's cave analogy. There are some prisoners chained up inside a cave and they are unable to move their bodies or to turn their necks around, and they are facing a wall. There are a group of people that walk behind them carrying statues of things, like ducks and trees, and behind them there is a mound with a fire on top which shines bright and casts shadows onto the wall. The prisoners, seeing the shadows of the objects, begin to name them as they go by, and they are happy and content with the knowledge that they have gained from naming the shadows. Then one day one of the prisoners breaks free from his shackles, and he turns around and sees the people walking in front of the fire carrying the statues that the prisoners had named that were cast on the cave's wall. He begins to climb an incline that ascends to the mouth of the cave, and although it is hard as the climb is plagued with suffering and pain, he gradually makes his way to the cave's entrance, which is where he can see a light. At first he is blinded by the light, however after a time his eyes adapt to it, and then he sees colors, shapes, trees and ducks. He could plainly see that the people had had mere copies of the real ducks and trees, and that the prisoners had seen distortions of those copies in the shadows on the cave's wall. After a while he began to look at the sun, and at first it burned his eyes, but like before he got used to the glare. Then he saw the sun as it truly was, realizing that the truth of the sun was that it was the source and was within everything, including himself. Suddenly he felt sorry for the prisoners with their distorted view of reality, so he went back to the cave and told them the truth, but they could not comprehend his wisdom, and they dismissed it as utter nonsense or total insanity. The prisoners are Joe Public in the physical world. The people carrying the statues are the politicians, teachers, media and negative friends and family that give us a false view of reality. He breaks free from the shackles with his desire to know the truth, and that is when the truth seeker awakes to the illusion. After that he climbs the incline to gain knowledge and wisdom, to where eventually he leaves the cave and sees things as they truly are in their true shapes and colors, which are the forms. The suffering and pain as he made his ascent to the cave's entrance. The former is to keep learning even when he doesn't want to, because he can think of better things to do with his time. The latter being to let go and give up his old views for new views on reality and head for the cave's entrance or the truth. The sun is the logos that gives off truth and wisdom to all the plants and creatures in the physical world, and is the source of all the forms. Going back to tell the prisoners the truth are the prophets. Visionaries or the seers who try to emancipate the prisoners from their shackles who are being beguiled by the teachers. Be it family, the media or the government. Plato believed that you didn't learn knowledge. He believed that the knowledge that one sought was already in one's soul, waiting to be recognized by the student or truth seeker. Basically, one doesn't learn knowledge as such. For Plato, one brings forth the knowledge that was already there in the soul mind from one's past, present or from the afterlife, stating that we carry knowledge in our souls, then forget when we are born. He goes on to say that as we search we awake to the knowledge within by recognizing the truth and connecting to logos. Some speculate that the life, truth and the death of Socrates are synonymous with the chronicles of the Jesus of Nazareth, along with other pagan esoteric tales and spiritual wisdom. And as for the original sin, it is said that it is an allegory of the journey of human consciousness. From the serpent, the animal mind, to Eve, the emotional mind, and then to Adam, the logical mind, and the forbidden fruit, self-consciousness, which makes them aware of their vulnerabilities and their pains, when God who sees all evicts them from Mesopotamia. The animal mind tempts the emotional mind, which in turn coerces the logical mind to eat the apple, to achieve self-awareness, and loses its innocence and cuts itself off from God. Nietzsche. Beyond good and evil. In his book Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche wrote that all the philosophers up until his time were confused by their preconceived ideas or through flattery to gain power from their truths that they gained as they taught and or explained. Spinoza had no structure to his personality, so he created one with mathematics. Descartes built his on doubt. Kant's was built on routine in order that was in accordance with his Germanic personality, and Schopenhauer who valued that to shut oneself away from all the pain and suffering of the world in the middle of nowhere and focus all your attention on the aesthetics things in life was the only ticket to heaven, and the Christian's theosophy was from fear, weakness, abstinence and poverty, or the antitheses of the Romans' lifestyle and mindset. Nietzsche proposed that the basic force that creates our instincts and drives that are innate in all survival mechanisms is the attainment of power in order to survive, which he called the will to power. Because of this, the works of the past philosophers were not objective facts, they were tainted concepts or hypotheses that were blinded by their preconceived ideas or personal novelties that correlated with the philosophers' own truths that flattered them intellectually, and they gained power from knowledge. However, knowledge acquired in this way is not an objective truth, but a truth that has been tainted by the philosopher's will to power, and just like the surgeon cannot perform a surgery with a dirty scalpel, as it is not pure and will lead to an infection, so it is with the truth that gets corrupted by the philosopher's need not to uncover the truth but to conquer the truth and hence hold a position of power. Descartes, when he stated without a doubt that the I existed, he presumed that the I existed before his conclusion. When he wrote his famous premise, "I think therefore I am," which is a circular argument. On top of that, he presumed that the I or the self is singular, whereas in truth it is probably a collection of thoughts that are created with the interaction of the sensory input that has come through the senses, or 25,000 loops. So the I, the truth and God may be in accordance with this. Henceforth, if the truth be found, it will not be a singular truth but rather a collection of thoughts and ideas culminating into a contemporary spiritual philosophy. For Nietzsche, the crux of his book Beyond Good and Evil was to undermine and devalue the subjective beliefs of the past philosophers, and to suggest that just like the Christian's ethos was created from their weaknesses, like turn the other cheek instead of live by the sword, and their refusal to enjoy the fruits of life by restricting themselves with abstinence and seclusion. He wrote in his aforementioned book that the free spirits of the future should create an untainted contemporary philosophy that is built on the strengths of and not the weaknesses of life, thus creating a modern religion that's values are centered on the admiration of strong personalities, good living standards, wealth and affluence by utilizing the will to power. In ancient Greece, their theosophical beliefs were built on gratitude towards their gods, whereas the primal Christian philosophers' theology were built from fear and weakness of the Roman Jewish slaves who were envious and desired their power. So they forged a theosophy that was taken from a plethora of ancient pagan beliefs and mythologies, where they hypothesized that to wield power was evil and that to turn the other cheek and only living a life in the complete opposite of the Romans' mindset and culture was the correct path or the way to heaven. The Romans ruled and created order in their empire with mighty armies. And in their lifestyles, when they were not focused on their political agendas, they had parties with lashings of food, wine and unadulterated sex. So the slaves, out of pure envy and their innate built-in desire for power, declared that that kind of lifestyle was a sin or evil and that theirs was good, thus creating the good versus evil hypothesis. Basically, the primal Christians were envious of the Romans' lifestyle because they were weak slaves and they had no power in their own lives. So the Jewish slaves wanted what the Romans had, but the Romans had the cap on it because they were strong and they ruled most of the material world. So because they were impotent slaves and they could not attain any power from the material world, they set their sights on the spirit world to achieve it, to gain their innate will to power. In a nutshell, they declared that the point of life was not to live like the Romans did, but to live life in the complete opposite way. Therefore, they valued poverty, suffering and abstinence over wealth, affluence, sex and power, which for their priests meant locking themselves away in a monastery, living a life of poverty and abstinence while they were researching their doctrines and saying prayers to connect to their one God. In a nutshell, taking the above into account, the primal Christian's theosophy was built on weakness, fear and envy of the Romans' rules and lifestyle. However, perhaps it was an awareness of and/or a connection to the higher self that correlated and still correlates with one's intellect and natural laws of theosophy. Philosophy, ethics and spiritual equilibrium. Gurdjieff's ladder. Gurdjieff said that humanity has their feet placed firmly on the ground and their heads high up in the stars, which could be seen metaphorically as a ladder from the very mundane ordinary self that focuses on the physical world in their corporeal flesh to the higher intelligent spiritual self that focuses on the intellectual and spiritual aspects of life and creation. He goes on to say that we must find a natural balance between the two by bringing them together, by fixing our attention on them and finding a mediator or an interface with the aid of meditation or intellectual pursuit, so that they can communicate and unify and turn on or activate our souls. Basically, like the Gnostics believed that the nails keep one attached to the cross, which are one's drives and impulses that keep one imprisoned in the flesh, and what were nails for Jesus were strings for Pinocchio. So it is the eradication of one's drives and impulses and the abolition of one's negative emotions is what leads to Gurdjieff's hypothesis of mindfulness. Allegorically speaking, Gurdjieff said that most people look at the ground for stability and security, and they are unaware of the sky above, in their lower self. But deep within their hearts they want to rise up and see the stars in their higher self. So we must find a balance and unity with one's negative and positive traits in one's psyche by vanquishing one's inner and outer negativity, thus creating one soul that is the interface between the two mindsets or selves to attain G's mindfulness. Gurdjieff said that the two opposites of the lower and higher self within human nature must communicate and find unity. However, to say that they must communicate and merge is one thing, but they just do not speak the same language or have the same natures, as the lower nature is driven by its instincts and is earthbound, and the higher nature is intellectual and in touch with spirit or its God consciousness. So one needs an interface or a mediator to get the two selves to communicate and achieve spiritual harmony or balance. To achieve this, one must fix one's attention on the lower and higher self's natures with meditation, prayer, or through one's intellect or intelligence. Once put into practice, the two natures become active and a higher state of awareness is achieved, which is called objective consciousness or mindfulness, and subsequently a soul is manifested, which becomes the interface between the two natures, and unification is finally attained. Apparently, we must also transcend the negative constraints that distract us from achieving our spiritual ascendancy or altered state. So one must transcend one's negative emotions by avoiding negativity. You can be distracted by a noisy mind or caught up in your own head with inner chattering, and you are not able to listen or reflect objectively on what others say. Then you have outer chattering, which is when one speaks small talk out of habit or because they are afraid of sitting in silence among small or large crowds like a classroom or a bus. Next, it's inner considering or constantly wondering what others think of them to be aware of what is actually happening. Then comes outer considering, which is when one thinks they are able to know strangers from a glance. For example, they blurt out, "I know you," when it's blatantly obvious that it's a lie. After that, you have identification. This is when one identifies oneself to an occupation, institution, or an event, like a carpenter, teacher, laborer, soothsayer, priest, or a musician. Then there is lying, when one is not comfortable with their true self, so they create falsities with their untruthfulness, and one loses touch of attaining intent or conscious attention. After that, negative emotions keep us caught up in our own social dramas, such as jealousy, self-pity, irritability, anger, fear, boredom and depression, and finally our chief feature keeps us locked in the ego with our social dramas. Paranoia or asleep, and we must all awake and or achieve G's mindfulness. Ouspensky. According to Ouspensky, Gurdjieff's one-time apprentice, people experience life through their perspectives, which he put into 4 categories. First, you have the defective mind. This is where people find themselves involved in institutions like crime, work, or religion. Then, you have the logical mindset, where people can only see through the eyes of logic, and it is the most common because it helps one deal with life and its everyday situations, such as 2 + 2 makes 4, or the Eiffel Tower is in Paris, France. They will only believe in something if they have proof or see it for themselves, and if they are told that it is beyond their own capabilities, then they will call it intellectual incontinence. When they deal with situations that are above or beyond logic, they collapse in on themselves, and then they become defective. When the logical mind knows its limitations, it becomes the psychological mindset, and it is able to see from different perspectives, and can see both the limitations of the logical and the irrationality of the defective mindset, and can also understand the workings of the higher esoteric mind state and see its many manifestations, like its wisdom and knowledge, which the logical and the defective mindsets cannot perceive. They understand the existence of a higher mind and can see that the Gospels were written by such a mind but still human. Finally, the esoteric mind sees from a higher perspective, form esoteric circles, practice occultism, and gain spiritual wisdom.